Hi there. This video has been put together to take you a little bit deeper into some elements of Turabian, which is the writing manual that we use here at SUM. I do encourage you to be sure to look at the SUM Turabian writing manual. It will have even more details and examples. The example that I'm going to share with you today in this video, I need to make it very, very clear that this was a PhD paper that someone wrote. This was not written at the undergraduate level. This was not even written at the master's degree level. It was written by a PhD student. I'm using this particular paper because this student used so many different kinds of footnotes, and it will really help me to illustrate to you guys as undergraduate students how to use footnotes and how they're supposed to look when you're writing a paper. So the things that I'll be reading you today, you're going to say to yourself, my goodness, that has nothing to do with Jesus, that has nothing to do with the Bible. It just so happens that in this particular student's paper, the part that really shows really good examples of footnotes isn't the part of the paper where the student was writing about biblical application. So I want you to know this is a Christian person that put this paper together, and I just wanted to clarify those things. So you'll be hearing some information that you're like, I have no idea what she's talking about. It's okay if you don't understand the sentences that are written in the paper. It's important that you understand how the student put the footnotes into the paper and how footnotes are supposed to look. The second thing that's important for you to understand is that for illustrative purposes only, I have used many different colors of highlight to show you sentences that I'm talking about, in particular footnotes that I'm talking about. When you post a Turabian style paper to SUM, to any of your classes, you would never, ever use any colors. You type only in black. You always use Times New Roman font. You would never highlight anything in a paper that you're turning in. Okay, having said those two things, let's get started. Sometimes students get a little confused as to what they should do if they get an idea from a book or a journal article and they write the idea, and it happens that in their paragraph that the idea starts on this page, but then it carries over into the next page as this idea did. We see here that there's a little number 5 there, so this means that this is a superscript number. This is indicating to the person reading this sentence that this sentence did not come out of the student's mind. The student is saying, hey, professor, I didn't get this out of my own brain. Don't accuse me of plagiarism. I got it from a particular source. So when we look at footnote number 5, that little teeny number there is called a superscript. Even though the information started on this page, the sentence carried over to the next page. And yes, this is page 67. Don't freak out. You don't have to write 67 pages for SUM. This was a person getting their doctorate. The sentence started on this page, but it ended on the next page. The footnote superscript number always goes at the end of the sentence or at the end of the phrase. So even though the idea started on this page, the superscript number doesn't go on that page because the superscript number goes at the end of the idea or the end of the sentence. So if the professor wants to know, where did this student get this idea about grounded theory methods? The professor would say, oh, the student is telling me that they footnoted that information in footnote number 5. So let's go down here into the footnotes. I can tell that I'm in the footnotes section because there's a short line right here. You'll notice that I've color-coded footnote number 5. Remember, the sentence up here was a yellow sentence, and it was footnote number 5. Down here, you can see that the student has indented the first line of their footnote. They've got the number 5 there. So if the professor wants to go and find the exact source where the student got this information that didn't come out of the student's brain, this professor can say, okay, the student is telling me that on page 249 of this book, it's italicized, by Denson and Lincoln, who are the editors, Within this chapter called Grounded Theory, Objectivist and Constructive Methods by Kathy Charmes, that's where the student found the information. So let me break this down for you. These people, Denson and Lincoln, had a really huge book called Strategies of Qualitative Inquiry. They're the editors of the book. They invited lots of other scholars to write chapters for their big book. Kathy Charmes wrote a chapter called Grounded Theory, Objectivist and Constructive Methods. The student found Kathy Charmes's chapter in the book by Denson and Lincoln, and the page that the student got the information from was page 249. When the professor looks at that footnote, they're going to understand that the student is saying that this information that the student has put in this long sentence, it didn't come out of the student's brain. That way the professor won't accuse the student of plagiarizing. The student is saying, hey, I read this information in this book on page 249. Now let's look at this footnote carefully. I've already noted that it's indented. We always do first name first in footnote. Then we have a comma. Because this happened to be a chapter, the name of the chapter is in quotation marks. Because this is the name of a book, the name of the book is italicized. We have parentheses around the place of publication. The publisher was Sage. That's the name of the publisher. It was published in 2003, closing parentheses, and a comma, and then a space, and then the page number, and then a period. So for this instance, this is an illustration of using a chapter in a book and to footnote that. Let's go into this footnote. So we're saying that all of this information also came from outside of the student's brain. It says it's footnote number 6. So let's look down at footnote number 6, which also is color coordinated in green. When we see the word ibid, it means in the same place as. So what the student is telling the professor is that while I was reading this book, this chapter, I flipped over to page 250 in this same source. So imagine you're holding the chapter in your hand by Kathy Charmes, and you have the page open to 249, and you found some really good information, and you put that in your paper there, and you footnoted number 5, and you flipped over to the very next page, and you found even more good information. You would let the reader know that this was ibid, in the same place as. So the person reading your paper would know, oh, okay, this information on page 250 came from Kathy Charmes's chapter in this book, and that the student is simply saying this is ibid. You can only ibid in a footnote if the information comes directly after what you've just read in your footnote. For example, if the student had gone here and made a footnote that didn't have anything to do with Kathy Charmes, you couldn't ibid. You can only put an ibid if indeed where it says in the same place as, or where it means in the same place as, it's the one directly above it. You can check out the SUM Turabian Writing Guide if you need more information on that. You'll notice that this is also, it's indented. We always indent the first line of every footnote. So let's look at this footnote. This is another indication the student is saying this also came out of another source. This has a quotation mark around it. This is indicating the student is saying not only did this come out of another source, but word for word. This is exactly what was written in that other source. These quotation marks indicate to the reader that these are exactly quoted words. It's very, very important. Even if you put a footnote, if you're quoting someone exactly word for word what they said, if it's 4 lines or less, it has to be in quotation marks. If it's 5 lines or more, it has to be in a block quotation. So the student is saying that essentially an inductive strategy for generating and confirming theory that emerges from close involvement and direct contact with the empirical world. They're saying, I didn't make up any of those words. Those are word for word, the exact words that the person in footnote 7 wrote in their book or in their journal article. So footnote number 7, if the professor goes to page 153 of Michael Quinton Patton's book, Qualitative Evaluation and Research Methods, the second edition from Newbury Park, California, Sage, 1990, if he goes to that page 153, the professor will be able to see that exact set of wording. So the student is saying, look, I'm doing a direct quote. I'm directly quoting something that I read. And it's okay to do that from time to time as long as you include the quotation marks or the block quote, and as long as you put a footnote in there. Again, the first line is indented. Let's look at this footnote example here. Here's another sentence that the student is saying, look, I footnoted this. I didn't get this out of my own mind. I got this out of another source. We go down here, footnote number 8. It's indented, the first line, and you can see that in this particular case, the student has the grounded theory review. This is a journal article. I can tell it's a journal article because it has an issue number and a volume number. The quotation marks here indicate that this is an article inside of a periodical or a journal called the Grounded Theory Review. The person has indented and they've included all of the pertinent information. Notice that when you use a journal article, that the way that you format it is different than if you're just formatting a book. So notice the difference between those. And I do encourage you, look at your Turabian book and also look at the SUM Turabian Writing Guide. The next thing we're going to do is look at the sentence that goes with this footnote. Again, the student is indicating, I got this information from outside of my own brain. So let's look at footnote number 9. The student has indented. The student has said, I've got information from John Criswell, and in this one footnote number 9, I've gotten information from Lyons and Cole's book. So here we have an example of what we would call a complex footnote, where the student is saying, I used 2 different sources and I put them into one footnote. The student is saying that both of these sources are basically saying the same thing. It's a really powerful move when a student says, I have one sentence supported by 2 different footnotes. Again, notice this is indented on the first line, indented, 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 indented. Notice we put a period at the end of each one of the footnotes. And notice the difference depending on what source you're using. If you're using a chapter, if you're doing IBID, if you are doing just a book, if you are using a journal article, and then if you are using, here we have 2 books together in a complex note. I'm going to take you in just a moment and show you a bibliographic entry in this same video. Here I've taken you to the bibliographic page or the bibliography page for this particular paper that the student has written. Remember, this is a PhD paper. This is not an undergraduate paper. This person has to have a lot more sources. I want you to notice that on the bibliography page that it's put in alphabetical order by the author's last name. Can you see that? These are all in alphabetical order. So while in footnotes, it's first name first in footnotes, on the bibliography page, it's the last name first with a comma and then a period. And then you put, in this particular case, this happened to be a book, so it's italicized. And sometimes you'll have so much information on the first line that it runs over to the second line. The second line, third line, fourth line is always indented. This is called a hanging indent. you'll remember in a footnote that the first line was indented. However, on your bibliography page, the first line is flush left and all of the additional lines are indented. See how this is indented? And this one, the spiritual dimensions of childhood, it took up too much room on that piece of the paper. And so the computer automatically put it down there. Your computer may not automatically do a hanging indent, so you'll have to tell it to do that. So you see all these examples of hanging indents. And here's an example. This particular source was a pretty short source, and it ended right there. So there's no second or third line to do a hanging indent on. On this particular one, it did automatically go to the next line. So you want to make sure you have hanging indents on all. And here's one where there's two. This line was so long, it took it to the second line and it took it to the third line. And you see there's a hanging indent and there's a hanging indent. Again, I'm going to go ahead and unhighlight all of this stuff because you would never, ever, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to do this. I want to unhighlight everything because you would never turn in anything Turabian paper that had any highlights in it. So I hope this has been helpful to you. I do want to encourage you use the SUM Turabian writing guide. And if you have questions, you can email your professor and ask your professor questions. I want to let you know that whether you're in my class, you're in another class, we're just so happy to have you at SUM. And we are praying for you guys to have a wonderful, wonderful trimester and praying God's blessings upon you.